Greetings, dear subscribers and casual listeners of my channel. Today, we once again turn our attention to one of the most hated characters in the entire Harry Potter saga. And no, it's not Voldemort. It's a woman whose pink cardigan and sugary smile instilled just as much fear in Hogwarts students as the Dark Lord himself. Of course, we're talking about Dolores Umbridge. How did she manage to surpass even he who must not be named in terms of fan hatred? Why does she provoke such a visceral reaction even years after the books and films were released? I've gathered most striking facts about Dolores Umbridge, a woman whose evil hid behind lace, bows, and fake politeness. Enjoy the video. Number 1. The horcrux didn't make her evil. One of the most curious moments in the final book is when Harry, Ron, and Hermione infiltrate the Ministry of Magic and discover that Umbridge is wearing a locket, one of Voldemort's horcruxes. She claims it's a family heirloom from the Selwyns, an ancient pure-blood family. But here's what's interesting. While horcruxes usually magnify the darkness in a person's soul, in Dolores' case, nothing changed. Umbridge was already deeply corrupt, cruel, and fanatical. The locket merely accentuated it. It didn't turn her into a monster, it simply ended up in the hands of one. Number 2, she was a half-blood who hid her background. Ironically, Umbridge despised Muggleborns and half-bloods, even though she herself was one. Her mother was a Muggle, and her younger brother was a squib. Dolores was ashamed of her family from an early age. She cut ties with her mother and forced her father, a low-ranking ministry worker, to retire, all to conceal her roots. Whenever asked about him, she'd offer a strained smile and insist that Orford Umbridge, the man who scrubbed floors, had nothing to do with her. She presented herself as a pureblood and fiercely guarded that illusion. Number 3. Her career climb was ruthless. Right after graduating from Hogwarts, Umbridge landed an internship in the Ministry's Department for the Improper Use of Magic. She quickly realized that power doesn't belong to the kind and fair, but to those who know how to manipulate and impose their will. Her rise was swift. She became Senior Undersecretary to the Minister for Magic and a member of the Wizengamot, not through merit or valor, but through flattery, deceit, and ruthless ambition. Number 4, she led the Muggleborn Registration Commission. When Voldemort took over, Umbridge finally got what she always craved, real power over the impure. She was appointed head of the Muggleborn Registration Commission. Under the guise of legality, the commission became a courtroom of horror. Muggleborn witches and wizards were accused of stealing magic and sent to Azkaban. Dolores did all this with genuine satisfaction, smiling sweetly in her lace collar. She took pleasure in others' suffering. Number 5. A short wand for a small mind. Umbridge's wand is only 8 inches long, one of the shortest in the entire series. Made of elmwood with a unicorn hair core, it mirrors its owner, seemingly sweet on the outside, but narrow-minded and cruel within. Ollivander once said that shorter wands often belong to people with limited vision and weak moral values. Umbridge is a textbook example of his words. Number 6, a lone woman. Despite all her efforts, despite her high position and attempts to form advantageous relationships, Umbridge never married. Her harsh tone, fanatical beliefs, and obsessive cruelty repelled even the most cold-hearted and elitist wizards. Rumors claimed she tried to orchestrate accidental encounters with promising men, especially those in power, but anyone who got to know her kept their distance. Her ideas about discipline, blood purity, and control were too disturbing even for staunch regime supporters. Number 7, Hogwarts rejected her from the start. Many think Umbridge's unpopularity began when she came to teach defense against the dark arts, but in truth, she was already disliked during her school years. Even among Slytherins, who often valued ambition and elitism, Dolores was seen as fake and unpleasant. Horace Slughorn, the head of house, refused to make her a prefect despite her eagerness for authority. Perhaps he sensed early on that this girl should never be given power. Number 8, obsessed with pink and cats. Dolores Umbridge hid her cruelty behind teacups and kittens. Her office at Hogwarts looked like a child's fantasy. Pink walls, embroidered cushions, lace curtains, and shelves lined with tiny porcelain plates. Each plate displayed a moving cat, purring, stretching, or licking its paws. They meowed in chorus when someone entered, but beneath the sugar-sweet exterior was something twisted. "Have a biscuit, Potter," she once said with a fake smile, moments before threatening him with torture. The room felt like a trap, soft on the outside, sharp on the inside. Even other professors felt uneasy inside her space. Professor Flitwick once joked that stepping into her office gave him a toothache. But no one truly laughed. The contrast was too jarring. Her love of cats wasn't affection, it was control. They sat on the walls and watched, just like she did. The pink wasn't warmth, it was camouflage. Students learned quickly, the more pleasant her voice, the worse the punishment, and the brighter the room, the darker the intentions hiding inside. Number 9, collector of magical torture devices. The blood quill was only the beginning. Dolores Umbridge kept it locked in her drawer like a prize. When Harry was forced to write, "I must not tell lies," the words carved themselves into the back of his hand. No ink, just pain. And she watched him do it, smiling. "You deserve to be punished," she said, sweetly. But the quill wasn't unique. Whispers in the ministry spoke of other tools, enchanted cuffs that tightened with every lie, chairs that recorded your secrets, cursed scrolls that erased memory. She called them disciplinary aids. Others called them torture devices. Students at Hogwarts learned quickly. Disobedience brought more than detention. Lee Jordan had his hands burned. Michael Corner lost the ability to speak for a day. Even the portraits avoided her gaze. Umbridge believed pain was a teacher and control was kindness. Her office, filled with lace and cats, hid something colder beneath. No one ever proved she collected magical punishments, but every time a student emerged from her room shaking, the school knew one thing: her methods didn't belong in a classroom, they belonged in a dungeon. Number 10, hated, half-human creatures. Dolores Umbridge never hid her disgust for magical beings she considered less than human. She saw werewolves, centaurs, giants, and even half-breeds as threats to purity. Her hatred wasn't political, it was personal. She once proposed laws banning part humans from holding any position in the ministry. She worked against Rubeus Hagrid the moment she learned he was half-giant. "Not quite human, is he?" she whispered with a smirk. She failed to fire him only because she couldn't find legal grounds fast enough, but she tried, repeatedly. Her worst moment came deep inside the Forbidden Forest. Armed with arrogance and her wand, she insulted a group of centaurs to their faces. She called them filthy half-breeds and ordered them to bow to her ministry authority. The forest answered in fury. The centaurs dragged her screaming into the trees. "Filthy half-breeds, are we?" one of them snarled. For the first time her laws meant nothing, her power meant nothing, her wand, flung from her hand, couldn't protect her. She vanished into the dark and came back broken. After that she never spoke of the centaurs again. But something had changed. Her hatred didn't fade, it grew darker. She called for stronger regulation of non-human threats. She insisted on curfews for werewolves, tighter controls on giants, and surveillance on goblins. But even inside the ministry some began to whisper, what did she see in that forest? What did they do to her that stripped the smile from her voice? No one ever knew, and Umbridge never forgave them for it. Number 11, not in the order, but knew too much. Dolores Umbridge was never part of the Order of the Phoenix, but somehow she always seemed to know what they were doing. She wasn't just informed, she was prepared. When Harry began gathering students to form Dumbledore's army, she knew almost immediately. When secret meetings happened in the Room of Requirement, she had students like Marietta Edgecombe watching. "She's a sneak," Hermione said through clenched teeth when Marietta betrayed them. But Marietta didn't act alone. Umbridge had a network, small, loyal, afraid. Some were students, others were ministry workers, all were afraid to say no. Even McGonagall couldn't explain how Umbridge moved so quickly. "She has eyes everywhere," the professor once muttered, after being interrupted for the third time in a week. Every whispered plan, every coded message between students seemed to end up on Umbridge's desk. She intercepted Owlpost, she tracked wand usage, she even monitored the flu network from her fireplace. It wasn't just control, it was surveillance. Dumbledore never said how she got her information, but he knew she had it, and that made her dangerous. There were rumours in the ministry, quiet ones, that Umbridge had informants planted in every department. Some said she used Veritaserum in private interrogations. Others believed she had spies among parents who feared for their children's future. Lucius Malfoy once spoke of her with respect. "She gets things done," he said. That alone was enough to make people nervous. She didn't need to be in the Order, she just needed to know where it would strike. And somehow, she always did. That was her true strength, not magic, not force, but information. When Harry snuck out to use Sirius Black's mirror, she was waiting. When Hagrid took his half-giant brother into the forest, she found out. When Dumbledore vanished, she moved in before the dust had settled. She didn't just fight the Order, she hunted it, and she nearly won, not because she was strong, but because she was always watching. Number 12. Master of Legal Manipulation. Dolores Umbridge never needed brute force. She had something better: paper, ink, and loopholes. In the ministry, she became infamous for twisting laws into weapons. She didn't break the rules, she rewrote them, and when rewriting wasn't possible, she reinterpreted them until the meaning bent to her will. "The ministry has always prioritized order," she once said, but what she meant was control, her control. At Hogwarts, she unleashed her talent with full force. Every week a new educational decree appeared on the wall. Number 22 gave her the power to fire professors. Number 24 banned student gatherings. Number 26 forbade teachers from discussing anything outside the syllabus. She wasn't just enforcing rules, she was manufacturing them. "As High Inquisitor," she told Professor McGonagall, "I have the right to inspect your lessons." McGonagall's response was ice cold. "You have the right to perform your duties. That's not the same thing." But Umbridge didn't care about the difference. She created a system so rigid and legalistic that resistance itself became a punishable crime. Even the staff had to watch every word. One wrong sentence could be labelled subversive. She used ministry language like a shield. She waved parchments instead of wands. She didn't hex, she silenced. And students quickly realized that even magic was powerless against a rule carved in ink and signed with the ministry's seal. But beneath her legal genius was something darker. Umbridge didn't love the law, she loved what it let her do. She loved turning justice into obedience. Her decrees weren't just tools, they were traps. The law became her disguise, and for a time it worked. She stood behind it like a queen behind armor, but in the end, no amount of parchment could hide what she truly was. Not from the students, not from the court, and not from history. Number 13, she was put on trial after the war. After the fall of Voldemort, Dolores Umbridge did what she had always done best. She lied. She claimed she had only followed orders, that she had acted out of fear, that she had tried to keep the peace. But the world had changed. People remembered now, and they were not afraid to speak. Former students came forward, so did Muggleborn witches and wizards who had faced her during the ministry trials. They told the Wizengamot what she really was, a torturer in pink. Mary Cattermole, who had once stood before Umbridge in the Muggleborn Registration Commission, returned to testify. She described the coldness in Dolores's voice, the gleam of pleasure in her eyes, the chained courtroom where her wand had been taken. "She said I stole my magic," Mary whispered in front of the court, and she smiled while saying it. There were others, dozens of them. Testimonies poured in, letters, memories, even magical pensives offered undeniable proof of Umbridge's cruelty. The evidence crushed her carefully polished image. The sweet giggle, the kitten brooches, the lace collars, none of it mattered anymore. What stood before the court was not a harmless bureaucrat, but a woman who had enjoyed the fear of children, who had scarred hands and minds. Kingsley Shacklebolt, now Minister for Magic, refused to protect her. He knew what she had done. "We fight for justice now," he said, "not for the illusion of order." Umbridge was sentenced for crimes against Muggleborns, abuse of power, and use of illegal magical punishments. Her title was stripped, her name erased from the official rolls of the ministry. She was sent to Azkaban not for her politics, but for her pleasure in cruelty. She left behind no allies, no defenders, no legacy, except for the pain etched into the memories of those she tried to crush. Number 14, fanatic hatred toward Dumbledore. Dolores Umbridge hated Albus Dumbledore with a quiet, simmering rage that grew long before she ever stepped into Hogwarts as High Inquisitor. To her, he was the embodiment of everything wrong with the wizarding world, too kind, too tolerant, too powerful. She despised his support of Muggleborns, his fondness for half-breeds, like Hagrid, and most of all, his influence. She once referred to him with a sneer as dangerously unorthodox. His very existence threatened her ideal of a rigid, controlled magical society. She wanted obedience. He inspired rebellion. When Umbridge arrived at Hogwarts in Order of the Phoenix, her mission wasn't just oversight, it was sabotage. She masked her power grab with ministry-backed decrees, but her real target was Dumbledore. Every move she made aimed to undermine him. She dismissed Trelawney, tried to fire Hagrid, and placed herself in charge of all educational matters, yet she failed to anticipate Dumbledore's resilience and his students' loyalty. Dumbledore's army, the secret group formed by Harry, wasn't just a rebellion, it was proof that her control was never absolute. Her hatred was personal. Dumbledore's calm demeanor infuriated her. When he calmly accepted his removal from Hogwarts, even escaping the ministry's attempt to arrest him, she was humiliated. "You seem to be laboring under the delusion that I am going to—" "What is the phrase? Come quietly," Dumbledore said, smiling gently. Then he vanished with Fawkes in a flash of phoenix fire, leaving ministry officials dumbfounded. Umbridge was left behind, fuming in silence. That moment shattered her illusion of control. But she couldn't destroy his legacy. No matter how many decrees she passed or how many punishments she assigned, Dumbledore's name echoed through the castle like a quiet anthem of resistance. Students whispered it in hallways, teachers shielded it behind polite smiles, even the walls of the castle seemed to resist her. Dolores Umbridge came with power and rules, but Albus Dumbledore ruled with truth. And that was something she could never touch. Number 15, creator of the most hated educational decree. Dolores Umbridge had always been a figure that inspired unease, but it was not until she issued Educational Decree number 26 that her true intentions became impossible to ignore. Her pink cardigans and kitten plates had masked the iron fist beneath the lace. The decree, which forbade all Hogwarts teachers from discussing anything beyond the strict confines of their subject matter, was not a mere bureaucratic formality. It was a calculated move, a tool of censorship designed to sever the students from truth, loyalty, and resistance. With a single signature, Umbridge turned education into imprisonment, cutting every corridor of Hogwarts off from the winds of the outside world. Before the decree, Hogwarts had still been a place where students could catch whispers of the real world in passing, perhaps from Professor McGonagall during a stray comment, or through a knowing glance from Professor Sprout. Even Professor Flitwick, who rarely discussed matters beyond charms, might allow a hint of concern to creep into his tone. These moments were fleeting but crucial. They reminded students that the walls of the castle were not impenetrable, that what happened outside mattered deeply inside, but Umbridge's decree was a scalpel, slicing away that fragile line of connection. She did not want students to know, she wanted them to obey. The language of the decree was deliberately vague, giving her wide latitude for interpretation. Teachers are hereby forbidden from making any reference, direct or indirect, to any topic not strictly related to the subject they are employed to teach, it stated coldly. That sentence alone was a muzzle placed tightly over the mouths of the Hogwarts staff. It was not enough for her to rule over the defense against the dark arts classroom with her punishing quill and cruel lessons. No, she needed to silence the entire school. Voldemort's return was no longer just a political problem for the Ministry. It was a truth that needed to be buried. Umbridge had been appointed High Inquisitor by Cornelius Fudge himself, a man so obsessed with denying the return of the Dark Lord that he entrusted Hogwarts to a woman with a taste for control that bordered on obsession. She was not content with inspecting teachers and finding fault with the likes of Trelawney or Hagrid. She needed ideological control. She needed to cut out any root of rebellion, any sapling of doubt. The decree ensured that even Dumbledore himself, headmaster and figure of respect across generations, could not speak freely to his students, and that perhaps had been her ultimate goal. It was Professor McGonagall who felt the weight of the decree most acutely. As deputy headmistress and a fierce believer in truth, she had always tried to guide her students, not just in Transfiguration, but in life. Her stern exterior was a shield for deep care. When the decree was issued, she stopped speaking about the Order of the Phoenix, about what was happening beyond the Forbidden Forest. Her silence became another victim of Umbridge's rule. The Ministry places a high value on the safety and well-being of its young witches and wizards, Umbridge would say in her sugary voice, but everyone knew that behind the words was a terror of the truth. Hermione Granger recognized immediately what was happening. She read the decree aloud in the common room, her brow furrowed with fury. "She wants to isolate us," she said bitterly, her eyes darting to Harry, who had been the first to suffer under Umbridge's regime. Hermione had always known that knowledge was power, but in the absence of truth, lies grow like thorns. The decree was a greenhouse for ignorance, a place where fear could be nurtured and shaped. Without access to real information, students were left to rumours, half-truths, and ministry-approved narratives. Umbridge's goal was not education, it was indoctrination. Harry felt it like a blow. He had already endured detention with her. The lines carved into his hand were still red. He knew what she was capable of. But this was something deeper. This was a war for the soul of Hogwarts. The decree didn't just silence the teachers, it delegitimized them. It told the students that their mentors were not to be trusted, that their questions were dangerous. When Harry tried to speak in class about Voldemort's return, Umbridge simply smiled and reminded him of the new rules. The truth, she implied, was a punishable offence. The day Educational Decree number 26 was posted on the wall, something shifted in the air. The students, who had grumbled and whispered before, now fell into an uneasy silence. Even the ghosts seemed to float more carefully through the corridors. Peeves, who delighted in chaos, found himself oddly quiet, perhaps recognizing that this was a different kind of war, one where rebellion could lead to expulsion or worse. The words on the decree were written in precise, neat script, but they carried the stench of dictatorship. Umbridge had not just written a rule, she had crafted a weapon. It was Fred and George Weasley who responded first with open defiance. They filled the hallways with tricks and fireworks, mocking the authority that sought to strangle their school. But their antics were not just jokes, they were protests. They refused to let Hogwarts become a ministry outpost. They understood that silence was complicity. Their actions were a warning to others. If you don't speak, if you don't act, then you are letting her win. And students listened. Not everyone was brave, but fear can be transformed when it finds a voice. Number 16. Suffered from a power complex. Dolores Umbridge never saw herself as a villain. In her mind, she was the embodiment of order, the guardian of traditions, and the voice of authority. But behind the pink cardigans, kitten plates, and deceptively sweet smile lay a psyche that thrived on power in its purest, most oppressive form. Her thirst for control didn't arise from a desire to do good, nor even from a hunger for recognition, but from something deeper and darker, an obsession with dominance. If psychologists had existed in the wizarding world, they would have diagnosed her with a full-blown authority complex built on insecurity, resentment, and a pathological need to exert control over those she viewed as inferior. From her earliest moments at Hogwarts in Order of the Phoenix, it became clear that Umbridge did not arrive merely to teach. She came to conquer. Appointed by the Ministry of Magic as the new Defense Against the Dark Arts professor, she wasted no time asserting dominance over both students and staff. Her very first lesson denied students the opportunity to use wands, a symbolic act that instantly stripped them of agency. "Wands away," she said. "You have no need for them in this class." It wasn't about safety or education, it was about disarming in every sense of the word. Teaching was secondary to obedience. Her voice, shrill and high-pitched, became a tool of psychological warfare. She relished the sound of her own decrees. Each educational decree she nailed to the wall was another brick in the fortress of her control. When she read out Decree number 26, restricting student gatherings, it was less an announcement and more a proclamation of conquest. The words weren't just rules, they were evidence that she was winning. Her language was always absolute, her punishments always humiliating. Even minor infractions were met with disproportionate responses. There was no tolerance for questioning her authority. For Umbridge, disagreement was rebellion, and rebellion had to be crushed. The most telling manifestation of her authority complex was her punishments. When Harry challenged her narrative about Voldemort's return, she forced him into detention, where he would write lines using a black quill that carved the words into his hand. "I must not tell lies," the message read, etched into his skin. This wasn't just discipline, it was domination. She wanted him to suffer, and more importantly, to submit. The pain was secondary to the victory of watching him bend to her will. Every scratch on Harry's hand was a scar on her enemy's resistance, a physical reminder that she was in charge. Her decor spoke volumes. Behind her desk sat not trophies of academic achievement or magical mastery, but rows of pink frills and images of kittens, a caricature of femininity that masked the rot beneath. These weren't personal touches, they were deliberate facades meant to disarm. Her room was a trap, comforting on the surface, suffocating underneath. Visitors might relax in her office at first, only to realize that every movement was being watched, every word measured. Even the decorative plates were enchanted to observe. Her environment mirrored her personality, sweetly sinister, calculated, inescapable. She was obsessed with uniforms, hierarchies, and silence. Students were expected to address her with robotic respect. She didn't want interaction, she wanted performance. She rewarded sycophants like Draco Malfoy, Pansy Parkinson, and her self-created inquisitorial squad, granting them unchecked power to police and punish. These students weren't chosen for their intelligence or leadership, but for their willingness to imitate her cruelty. In them, she saw reflections of herself, young tyrants in training. It was less about mentoring and more about multiplying her influence through fear. When her position was challenged, her behaviour became erratic. After Fred and George Weasley staged a spectacular rebellion, launching fireworks and swamp magic in the corridors, Umbridge didn't merely attempt to punish them. She sought to erase their existence from Hogwarts. The more the school slipped from her grasp, the more violent and hysterical her reaction became. Her authority was tied to her sense of identity. To lose power was, in her mind, to become nothing. Her control wasn't a job, it was a lifeline. Without it, she unraveled. She detested anyone who threatened her fragile superiority, especially those with actual merit or moral strength. Professor McGonagall, for instance, was the embodiment of quiet authority, firm but fair, respected without demanding it. To Umbridge, McGonagall was a threat because she didn't need cruelty to command a room. Their confrontations were like battles of philosophy. "I will have order!" Umbridge shrieked once, after McGonagall calmly refused to bend to her rules. But order to Umbridge meant unquestioning submission, not justice or peace. The louder she screamed, the more obvious her weakness became. Even her magical ability was average at best. Unlike Snape or Dumbledore, she possessed no deep knowledge or powerful spells. Her magic was shallow and bureaucratic, relying more on ministry-issued authority than personal talent. She surrounded herself with rules and paperwork not because they were effective, but because they masked her mediocrity. Her position gave her borrowed power, and she clung to it with the desperation of someone who knew they had nothing without it. Her brief stint as Hogwarts High Inquisitor and eventually as headmistress was marked by paranoia and surveillance. She deployed security measures not for protection, but for control. Her office resembled more a ministry department than a schoolroom. It was filled with folders on students, transcripts of conversations, and reports of rebellious behavior. These weren't educational tools, they were weapons. Her power complex thrived in secrecy, suspicion, and sabotage. The more isolated the students became, the stronger she felt. Number 17 believed in order, not justice. Dolores Umbridge was not a character driven by a thirst for power like Voldemort, nor by a pursuit of justice like Dumbledore. She was something more chilling, a believer in the righteousness of order for its own sake. In her mind, the world should operate like a finely tuned clock, where every cog knew its place, every hand moved in sync, and no part dared to challenge the system. To her, chaos wasn't simply dangerous, it was immoral. She saw rebellion not as a sign of injustice, but as a flaw in discipline. In her vision of the world, the strongest virtue was obedience, not empathy, and her life was built around the enforcement of rules she believed sacred. Unlike other characters whose convictions were born of struggle or loss, Umbridge seemed to find comfort in structure. That comfort evolved into a fanaticism. When she arrived at Hogwarts in Order of the Phoenix, her pink cardigan and sickly sweet voice were deceiving. Beneath the surface was a bureaucrat armed with quills, decrees, and an unshakable belief that rules, not truth, not kindness, were the ultimate form of justice. Her classroom was not a place of education, but of control. She prohibited questions, denied facts, and punished dissent with cruelty cloaked in civility. "You have been told," she reminded Harry with cold finality, "that you are not to talk." It was not a request. It was law. Her allegiance to the ministry wasn't born of loyalty to Cornelius Fudge himself, but rather to the structure the ministry represented. Even as Fudge lost touch with reality, denying Voldemort's return, Umbridge never wavered. She saw the ministry's version of the truth as absolute. Not because it made sense, but because it had been decreed. Her defense of the bureaucracy was rooted in ideology, not reason. When she enforced the educational decrees at Hogwarts, each one more authoritarian than the last, she wasn't acting from personal ambition, but from a terrifying belief that structure, even unjust structure, was always preferable to disorder. This belief is what made her so dangerous. While Death Eaters operated in the shadows, Umbridge corrupted the system from within. She didn't destroy the rules, she weaponized them. Her version of justice was blind not to race or wealth, but to context, compassion, and humanity. When she forced Harry to write lines with a cursed quill that carved the words into his skin, she saw it not as punishment, but correction. "I must not tell lies," became a sacred chant of her twisted faith. To her, the pain wasn't cruelty in disguise, it was order, asserting itself over chaos. In her world, authority was not to be earned, but obeyed. Her rise to power within Hogwarts was not through teaching skill or student support, but through decree, a ministry-appointed position handed down without consultation. Her new title, High Inquisitor, allowed her to inspect and ultimately remove professors who didn't conform to her standards. Trelawney's dismissal, which left the divination professors sobbing in the courtyard, was a striking moment that revealed Umbridge's lack of compassion, but in her eyes, Trelawney was simply a weak cog in the system, one that needed to be replaced for the machine to run more efficiently. Perhaps most revealing of her worldview was her response to Dumbledore's refusal to comply. He was a symbol of nuance, tolerance, and resistance, everything she despised. When he vanished from the school rather than be arrested by the ministry, she was not shaken, but thrilled. His removal allowed her system to operate without interference. It wasn't about justice, it was about compliance. In one moment of triumph, she even installed herself as head mistress, not to educate, but to monitor, restrict, and control. Under her rule, students were silenced, punished, and surveilled. She even formed the inquisitorial squad, student enforcers like Draco Malfoy, to reward those who reported on their peers. She did not seek understanding. She imposed submission. When she caught Harry trying to use the Flu network to communicate with Sirius, she was furious not because of the rule-breaking, but because he had stepped outside the system she trusted. "What Cornelius doesn't know," she hissed, "cannot hurt him." Her loyalty was not to truth, but to the maintenance of an illusion that everything was under control as long as nobody asked questions. In this way, she mirrored totalitarian ideologies in the real world, where maintaining the image of peace was more important than addressing the roots of conflict. The most haunting aspect of Umbridge's character was that she saw herself as righteous. When she ordered a group of centaurs to be attacked, calling them half-breeds, she was not ashamed. In her mind, she was protecting human society from what she saw as inferior and dangerous creatures. Her prejudice was masked by policy. She didn't hate out of emotion. She institutionalized hatred through rules. Her use of the blood quill on Muggleborns during her time as head of the Muggleborn Registration Commission showed just how far she was willing to go to preserve her version of order. She didn't question whether they were truly stealing magic, because the decree had said so. That was enough. This blind faith in hierarchy is what made her more chilling than even the Death Eaters. Bellatrix Lestrange may have relished in violence, but she didn't pretend it was justice. Umbridge, however, believed every cruel action was necessary for the greater good. A good defined not by moral principles, but by bureaucratic stability. In Deathly Hallows, when she wore Mad-Eye Moody's magical eye on her office door, likely taken from his corpse, she didn't see it as a trophy of conquest, but as a tool for surveillance. She justified the violation not out of cruelty, but out of necessity. Number 18, afraid of the truly powerful. Dolores Umbridge wore pink cardigans and bows like armor, but behind the lace and porcelain teacups was a woman gripped by fear. She strutted through the halls of Hogwarts with a twisted sense of power, handing out cruel punishments and decorating her office with plates of simpering kittens, as if to mask the darkness that pulsed beneath her sickly sweet exterior. She targeted the weak with surgical precision, Muggle-born students, rebellious children, and defenseless creatures. She reveled in control where resistance was minimal, yet When confronted with those who truly possessed power, real, commanding, undeniable magic, Umbridge's false confidence cracked like thin ice under pressure. Her fear was most visible in the presence of Albus Dumbledore. She paraded around Hogwarts as the High Inquisitor, rewriting rules and silencing dissent, but she never dared raise her voice against the headmaster. She questioned his authority from afar through ministry decrees and sly inspections, but whenever she stood before him, her tone softened, her eyes flickered with unease. Dumbledore, with his serene confidence and towering reputation, represented something Umbridge could never attain: authentic respect and deep magical strength. He didn't need bureaucracy to command a room, and that terrified her. As described in Order of the Phoenix, when Dumbledore enters a room, even Cornelius Fudge pauses. Umbridge, despite her ministry backing, hesitates to confront him directly. She concealed her fear behind protocol. When Dumbledore refused to admit to forming Dumbledore's army, she didn't confront him face to face. Instead, she leaned on Fudge's authority and arranged for his arrest through ministry channels. It was only when Dumbledore escaped that her mask momentarily slipped. She stood frozen, watching Fawkes blaze in golden fire, unable to respond. It was not anger or indignation that flooded her expression, it was fear. True power had walked away untouchable, and all her rules and reports meant nothing in that moment. She had no weapon against someone like him, and she knew it. Umbridge's cowardice became even more transparent when she was taken into the Forbidden Forest by Harry and Hermione. Convinced of her superiority, she followed the students with the same smugness she showed when assigning detentions. But when faced with the centaurs, fierce, intelligent, and immune to her intimidation, Umbridge crumbled. She called them filthy half-breeds and tried to assert her ministry title, but the centaurs were unmoved. Her power evaporated, her words meaningless in the face of raw, wild strength. She was reduced to a trembling wreck, carried off into the trees, screaming into the darkness. It was perhaps the most fitting consequence for someone who had bullied others from behind paper shields and government stamps. The scene in the forest was a reflection of Umbridge's deepest flaw. She misunderstood what real power looked like. In her world, power came from titles, committees, and the placement of quills on parchment. She believed herself untouchable because she was protected by Minister Fudge's umbrella, but that protection was conditional, temporary, and external. When isolated, without guards or rules to lean on, Umbridge revealed herself to be hollow. Her confidence was a mask painted thickly over her own insecurities. The moment that mask cracked, there was nothing left but a woman desperately trying to control what could not be tamed. Even among Death Eaters, Umbridge's fear of true magical dominance was evident. Though she never formally aligned herself with Voldemort, she adjusted quickly to the new regime, hiding behind her old titles and resuming her persecution of Muggleborns. But when the tables turned and Voldemort fell, she denied everything. She backtracked, pleaded innocence, and attempted to erase her own past. The same woman who sentenced Muggleborns to Azkaban under the pretense of protecting wizardkind suddenly insisted she had only been following orders. She buried her cruelty under excuses, revealing once again her inability to stand firm when the tide changed. Her courtroom behavior during Voldemort's rise, as described in Deathly Hallows, was particularly revealing. Sitting high above terrified Muggleborns, flanked by Dementors and issuing sentences with cold efficiency, she appeared confident. But this was not bravery. It was theatre. The room was stacked in her favor. She wore a locket she believed was Salazar Slytherin's, hoping it would bolster her image. But that locket was not a symbol of power. It was a horcrux, a fragment of Voldemort's soul that fed on fear. That Umbridge clung to it unknowingly was poetic justice. She wore evil like jewelry, not understanding the depth of what she adorned herself with. And yet, the moment Harry, Ron, and Hermione broke into the courtroom, catching her off guard, her false superiority shattered instantly. She panicked. She did not fight. She begged. This pattern repeated across every phase of her career. She ruled through intimidation, not strength. Her detentions at Hogwarts, where students like Harry had to carve words into their own skin, were not examples of strength, but of sanctioned cruelty. Her fear of open confrontation was always visible. She banned student groups, punished those who spoke out, and tried to suppress even music and laughter in the school. These were not acts of confidence, but attempts to control every variable. She didn't want to be questioned because she lacked the strength to defend her ideas. Silence, fear, and paperwork were her weapons of choice. When Harry confronted her about Voldemort's return, her reaction was telling. She laughed, yes, but not because she found the idea absurd. Her laughter was a reflex, mockery as defense. Deep down, she feared the idea that the Dark Lord could return because it would mean her safe world of structured control would collapse. She preferred lies to danger. The truth was too risky for someone like her, whose entire life was built on the illusion of safety through authority. Denying Voldemort's return was not just political, it was self-preservation. Umbridge's fear even extended to her own colleagues. She worked her way up the ministry by pretending to be useful and never challenging those above her. She clawed her way into Cornelius Fudge's inner circle, not with ideas, but with obedience. She did not challenge authority unless she believed it weak or faltering. When Scrimgeour replaced Fudge, she adapted quickly, never missing a chance to protect herself. And when Pius Thickness was installed under Voldemort's influence, she once again changed her allegiance. She had no ideology. Her loyalty was to power, but only when she felt it safe to serve. She detested those she considered beneath her because they posed no threat. House elves, for instance, were dismissed as creatures undeserving of rights. When Hermione formed SPEW, Umbridge's disdain was palpable. Why care about those who cannot fight back? Her hatred of centaurs and werewolves followed the same pattern. Remus Lupin, a competent and kind teacher, was removed from his post not because of incompetence, but because his very presence challenged her narrow view of magical superiority. She feared beings who existed outside her neat categories, who did not respond to her rules. What made her cruelty so chilling was its foundation in cowardice. It's easier to be brutal when you feel powerless. By punishing the vulnerable, Umbridge created the illusion of control. She needed others to fear her because she feared being irrelevant. Her punishments weren't merely disciplinary, they were performances. She needed witnesses to her power. And yet, whenever that power was truly tested by Dumbledore, by the centaurs, by Voldemort himself, it faltered. Her foundation was never solid. The irony of Umbridge's story lies in how desperately she tried to seem fearless. She projected certainty through her posture, her clipped tone, her pink clothes. But the symbols of comfort she surrounded herself with, the kittens, the tea, the frilly decor, were not signs of inner peace. They were barricades. Her environment was an attempt to control perception. She believed if she looked harmless, others would underestimate her, and if she looked sweet, her actions would appear justified. But true strength requires no disguise. Even after the war, Umbridge attempted to vanish into the bureaucratic fog she once mastered. She claimed she had no knowledge of Voldemort's plans, that she only followed the law. But the law, as she interpreted it, was a tool for oppression. She made choices, she wrote decrees, she signed papers that sent innocent people to Azkaban. The truth was that Dolores Umbridge feared accountability more than anything. Her entire life was a fortress built to avoid consequences, and yet that fortress was built on sand. In the end, Dolores Umbridge was not a powerful villain. She was a frightened woman who played powerful. She mistook cruelty for strength, obedience for wisdom, and silence for respect. Her legacy is not one of magical greatness or heroic conviction. It is a cautionary tale of what happens when fear masquerades as authority. And in the wizarding world, where true power speaks through action, heart, and sacrifice, Umbridge was never more than a whisper in the shadow of giants. Number 19, helped oppress werewolves. Dolores Umbridge wore pink. She adored kittens. She decorated her office with ornamental plates and sipped tea with a fixed, nauseating smile. But behind that saccharine exterior lurked one of the most ruthless minds the Ministry of Magic ever promoted. While many remember her reign of terror at Hogwarts, few realize the long shadow she cast over the lives of those who bore the curse of lycanthropy. Long before she carved her way into the educational system, Umbridge was a rising star in the Department for the Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures. Her ambitions were clear: bring order, eliminate risk, and enforce superiority. For her, werewolves were not misunderstood souls, but dangerous beasts masquerading as men. It was under her lobbying that the infamous werewolf registry was updated and weaponized. The registry, once a quiet bureaucratic ledger meant to track transformations for medical reasons, became a tool for surveillance. Umbridge insisted that civilized society must be protected from unnatural threats, a sentiment that masqueraded as safety but reeked of deep-seated prejudice. She didn't see individuals when she looked at people like Remus Lupin. She saw infection, instability, and filth. And with her rising influence, she ensured that the Ministry saw the same. When Remus Lupin left Hogwarts, his brilliance and compassion were never questioned. But doors closed wherever he went. He applied to over a dozen positions in the wizarding world. Each rejection carried the same undertone: safety concerns. That was no accident. Umbridge had championed laws that forbade werewolves from holding employment in any institution involving contact with children, medical environments, or public-facing roles. "The safety of our young witches and wizards is paramount," she declared, in a memorandum that circulated throughout the ministry. It sounded noble, but the effect was suffocating. Werewolves weren't just unemployed, they were invisible, forced into shadows, scraping by on whatever they could find. The werewolf support services, once a modest but vital lifeline for afflicted witches and wizards, was systematically dismantled under her watch. Medical care for lycanthropy, already limited, was redirected to less wasteful uses, as she called them. Funding dried up, clinics closed, potions became rare and expensive. Even Severus Snape, a man not known for kindness, had once brewed wolfsbane potion for Lupin during his Hogwarts tenure, but in the outside world, such support vanished. Umbridge argued that resources should not be squandered on dangerous elements, and so the message was sent: survive on your own or perish. The werewolf population, already marginalized, was thrust further into desperation. Many turned to Fenrir Greyback, not out of loyalty but out of sheer necessity. Greyback, a violent predator who delighted in the idea of turning children, built his pack from the wreckage Umbridge left behind. In her crusade to protect the wizarding world, she created the very threat she warned against. It was one of the cruelest ironies of her career. In trying to eradicate the danger of werewolves, she made the threat more feral, more organized, and more vengeful. Remus Lupin, a man who had never harmed a soul in his transformed state, found himself unable to afford wolfsbane. He began sleeping in abandoned buildings, begging for scraps in the Muggle world, hiding his identity and praying for the moon to pass without incident. "They all looked at me like I was a monster," he once told Harry, "even when I wasn't." It wasn't society that rejected him. It was the laws written by Umbridge's hand. She claimed she was protecting the people, but what she was really doing was punishing difference. Her actions weren't based on evidence or reason. They were grounded in fear and in a thirst for control. She pushed forward the Werewolf Code of Conduct, a policy that required all werewolves to report to local authorities before and after every full moon. Failure to do so resulted in imprisonment. But the reporting centres were far and few between, often run by auras with no medical training, treating their wards like criminals instead of patients. Lupin once attempted to comply, but after 3 consecutive full moons spent in a ministry holding cell with no wolfsbane, he gave up. He wasn't alone. Others simply stopped trying. Compliance became impossible. Disobedience became survival. Her disdain was rooted in a belief that beings afflicted by magic were inherently inferior. She saw herself as a purist, a defender of the natural order. In the ministry halls, she was applauded for her tough love approach. Her supporters referred to her policies as necessary firm measures. Her opponents, however, knew better. Kingsley Shacklebolt once remarked privately, "She doesn't care about the safety of the public. She just wants control." But few dared challenge her openly. Umbridge had the ear of the minister and, more importantly, the files. She collected information like other women collected jewelry. Secrets, weaknesses, rumors, all filed away and used with surgical cruelty. Her philosophy infected every branch she touched. In her personal notes, found later in her confiscated office, she wrote, "Lycanthropy is a scourge on magical society. They bring disease, fear, and degradation. Their tolerance is an act of national self-harm." There was no empathy in those words, no room for reformation. It wasn't a matter of behavior. One could be the kindest werewolf in Britain and it wouldn't matter. The crime was existing. The punishment was permanent. During her brief rise to power under Voldemort's puppet regime, she had free rein. While Muggleborns were being rounded up, Umbridge diverted resources to track unregistered non-humans. Her obsession with categorization and purity took on even darker tones. A memo dated during this period contained a list titled Potential Contamination Risks, in which known werewolves were placed alongside dark creatures and cursed artifacts. Lupin's name was there. So were others, some already dead, some who hadn't transformed in years. She saw no difference. To her, all were threats. One of the most tragic consequences of her policy was the forced separation of families. Parents who were werewolves were denied custody of their children. A man named Thomas Wicks, a wizard who had contracted lycanthropy in adulthood, lost custody of his 2 daughters under the Inhuman Proximity Statute, a law Umbridge drafted that barred non-humans from raising magical children. He fought the decision for years until his death, which went unnoticed by anyone but his daughters. The law remains a stain on the legal record of the ministry, quietly repealed after the war. In contrast, when asked about her actions during her post-war trial, Umbridge remained unmoved. "I followed the law," she said with a smirk. "If the law was harsh, then it was because harshness was required. But she had helped write those very laws. The court condemned her for abuses against Muggleborns, but the werewolves, forgotten, voiceless, discarded, received no justice. Their lives, shattered by her pen, were not even mentioned." Perhaps the most haunting legacy of Dolores Umbridge is the silence. The way she carried out repression, not with noise, but with memos, not with spells, but with policies. She made cruelty look administrative. She didn't wear a Death Eater's mask or carry a dark mark. She wore pink. She smiled. She justified everything with public good. And in doing so, she ruined lives with a terrifying sense of righteousness. As Remus Lupin walked alone through the alleys of wizarding London, jobless, sick, and hunted, not because of what he'd done, but because of what he was, it was Umbridge's name that echoed silently in every rejection, in every fearful glance, in every locked door. Her story serves as a reminder that monsters do not always snarl. Sometimes they purr, sometimes they decorate with kittens, and sometimes they pass laws. Number 20 secretly dreamed of becoming minister. Dolores Umbridge never bothered to conceal her thirst for power. Within the marble halls and spell-warded offices of the Ministry of Magic, her name was whispered with a peculiar mix of disdain and apprehension. While she wrapped herself in pink cardigans and porcelain kitten plates, beneath that sugary exterior simmered a ruthless ambition. She believed that her unwavering loyalty to the ministry, combined with her obsession for rules and order, made her not only worthy of leadership, but destined for it. More than once, colleagues recalled how she would linger after. Meetings with Cornelius Fudge, her eyes lingering on the minister's chair a moment too long, her words saturated with praise, so artificial it almost glowed. Her aspirations were an open secret, one few dared to confront openly. It wasn't just in idle conversation that her ambition leaked through. Dolores positioned herself strategically, first as senior undersecretary to the minister, and then, during the dark days of Voldemort's return, as Hogwarts High Inquisitor. These were not random assignments. Each was a calculated move in a silent campaign. "She's got eyes like a toad," one unnamed official remarked in the Daily Prophet, "but she watches like a hawk." During Fudge's tenure, she became a confidant, not by virtue of brilliance or vision, but through relentless flattery and an uncanny ability to echo his fears. Fudge feared Dumbledore, so Dolores feared him more. Fudge denied Voldemort's return, and so Dolores denied it more fervently. Her own opinions, if they ever existed, were buried beneath layers of expedient obedience. When Rufus Scrimgeour took office after Fudge's resignation, there was a shift. Scrimgeour, hardened by years in the Aura office, had little patience for sycophants. Dolores sensed the danger. Her survival instinct, honed over years of bureaucratic maneuvering, kicked in. She quickly aligned herself with Scrimgeour's hardline rhetoric, hoping to impress with her intolerance toward dissent and her rigid enforcement of magical law. She revamped internal memos, proposed stricter educational decrees, and intensified interrogations of so-called subversive elements within the magical community. But Scrimgeour was no fool. He saw through her performance and never allowed her closer than necessary. He tolerated her, but never trusted her. Behind closed doors, he often referred to her as a shadow that smiles. Even during the darkest chapter of ministry control, when the imperious-cursed Pious Thickness assumed the minister's chair under Voldemort's regime, Dolores adapted once again. She quickly rose in prominence, embracing the twisted ideology of blood purity with disturbing enthusiasm. She presided over Muggleborn Registration commissions, where terrified witches and wizards were forced to prove their magical lineage. In this grim theatre of injustice, Umbridge thrived. She wore Salazar Slytherin's locket, a stolen horcrux, as a badge of authority, completely unaware of the dark magic it contained. It served her purposes perfectly, projecting an image of ancient, noble, magical purity. To her, the object wasn't cursed, it was status. Those who worked beside her during this era noticed something chilling. She seemed to delight in the fear she instilled. She wasn't just enforcing the law, she was relishing it. She sat at her desk beneath her kitten portraits while condemning innocence. "You are lying, filthy half-breed," she snarled at Mary Catamol during one hearing. The quote, documented by eyewitness accounts, encapsulated her ideology. Her sense of morality was not only warped but fluid, moulded to fit whichever regime held the reins. Had Voldemort himself offered her the title of minister, she would have taken it with a curtsy. What makes her more terrifying than the overt Death Eaters is not her ideology, but her lack of one. Dolores Umbridge had no allegiance to anything beyond herself. While others fought for bloodlines, freedom, justice, or control, she fought only for proximity to power. This made her, paradoxically, more dangerous. Even within the Death Eater-controlled ministry, whispers about her circulated. Not because she was disloyal to Voldemort, but because she was loyal to no one. The magical elite, even those drunk on power, instinctively understood the risk of handing her real authority. It wasn't fear of rebellion, it was fear of betrayal. After the Battle of Hogwarts and Voldemort's downfall, Dolores was arrested for crimes against Muggleborns. Yet even in court she tried to play her old game. She wept in front of the Wizengamot, spoke of duty, order, and sacrifice. She painted herself as a misunderstood civil servant, a woman of rules caught in the tide of war. But this time, the act failed. Kingsley Shacklebolt, newly appointed Minister of Magic, saw her for what she was. He refused to show mercy. The record shows that Dolores was sentenced to Azkaban, not just for her role under the Death Eaters, but for a lifetime of cruelty veiled as legality. Her dream of becoming Minister of Magic died in a cold courtroom, surrounded not by admirers but by the testimony of those she had tormented. Yet her story continues to disturb many. Her name appears in the rise and fall of the dark arts, not as a Death Eater, but as a reminder that tyranny often wears polite faces. The curious thing is how long she stayed close to power. Her survival through 3 very different administrations, Fudge's fearful denial, Scrimgeour's pragmatic force, and Thickness's puppet regime, is nothing short of political shape-shifting. In a way, she almost succeeded. At one point, she was the most powerful woman in the ministry after the minister himself, only a heartbeat away. She held more real influence than many heads of department, including Arthur Weasley, who once muttered, "She doesn't cast spells, she casts shadows." Even her time at Hogwarts was a rehearsal for future leadership. As High Inquisitor, she imposed a regime of fear and control, stripping Dumbledore's power and attempting to mold the school in her image. She banned organizations, censored publications, and instituted loyalty checks. To students and teachers alike, it became clear she wasn't there to educate, she was there to dominate. Her obsession with control revealed what kind of minister she would have been, not one of vision or reform, but one of surveillance, punishment, and absolute obedience. Her appointment wasn't just a political error, it was a cautionary tale. Dolores believed that wearing the right brooch and quoting ministry protocol made her moral. She spoke in rules instead of truths, treated empathy as a weakness, and saw dissent as defiance. Her power didn't come from strength, but from proximity. That's what made her dangerous. She never cast a Cruciatus curse, but her detentions were remembered as worse. "I must not tell lies," carved into Harry Potter's hand, was not a spell but a scar, inflicted not by wand, but by bureaucratic cruelty. No one elected her, but she ruled as though they had. Colleagues remembered how she reacted to any perceived slight. A simple disagreement could land a co-worker in disciplinary review. One intern, Robert Muldoon, reportedly lost his job after suggesting a policy modification. His only mistake was offering a different view in a staff meeting. Dolores filed a formal complaint citing disruption of ministry decorum. The file was sealed. Robert never returned. In her world, disagreement was rebellion, and rebellion had no place. That wasn't strength. That was fear masquerading as order. There is an irony in her failure. She pursued power so desperately, yet every move she made to gain it exposed the reasons she could never hold it. Ministers need loyalty, but inspire it, not demand it. They need vision, but she had only self-interest. They need to listen, but Dolores only dictated. Those in true power recognized this. Fudge used her as a tool. Scrimgeour tolerated her. Thickness allowed her cruelty, but never entrusted her with command. Even Voldemort, who tolerated all kinds of fanaticism, gave her no seat among the Death Eaters, not because she lacked hatred, but because she lacked loyalty. Today, no photograph of her hangs in the ministry. Her name is rarely spoken aloud, but her legacy lingers in whispers. She was not the monster in the forest, but the one in the office next door, the kind of villain who smiles while ruining lives, the kind of leader who believes that position alone justifies punishment. She didn't fall from grace. She climbed a staircase built on silence and stumbled when truth caught up. And still, one imagines, in some cell in Azkaban, Dolores Umbridge dreams not of freedom or redemption, but of a chair behind a minister's desk and a wand resting neatly beside a teacup. Number 21 believed magic was a privilege, not a right. Dolores Umbridge was never just a teacher. She was a symbol, and her symbol was not one of light or guidance. It was one of silent tyranny hidden behind pink cardigans and porcelain cat plates. To many students at Hogwarts, her arrival marked the end of innocence, the moment when the school they loved began to feel like a prison, with polite smiles. She wasn't content to enforce rules. She wanted to rewrite what magic meant and who was worthy of it. While the surface of her character gleamed with fake sweetness, the truth was that she never believed magic was a universal right. For her, it was a matter of blood and lineage, a privilege of birth, not a gift of spirit or potential. When Hermione Granger began SPEW, a campaign for the ethical treatment of house elves, it was laughed at by many students, but Hermione's belief system ran deeper than elf rights. She truly believed that magic should elevate the world, not be hoarded by a few. She had seen what prejudice could do, from the whispers about her being a mudblood to the way even teachers sometimes dismissed her contributions. And while Hermione fought for a future where magic was shared and understood, Dolores Umbridge worked toward a world where magic was locked behind high gates, guarded by pure blood ideals, and denied to those she saw as unworthy. The appointment of Umbridge as the Defense Against the Dark Arts teacher was not just a political maneuver by the Ministry of Magic, it was a calculated insertion of a doctrine. Her lessons were stripped of practice, filled with dry readings and decrees, because in her mind, teaching children to defend themselves was dangerous. It gave them power, and power was something Umbridge only believed should belong to the right kind of wizard. Wands are, in the right hands, a tool of civilization, she once remarked in a ministry pamphlet. The implication was clear: a wrong hands existed, and she had appointed herself judge of who those were. One of the most disturbing aspects of Umbridge's reign at Hogwarts was her obsession with control, especially over the younger students. She created the Inquisitorial Squad, a group of students authorized to punish and spy on their peers. But her true focus was the subtle removal of hope. She didn't just want to punish rebellion, she wanted to extinguish the idea that those who didn't fit her mold could succeed. Her policies were carefully constructed barriers, rules about what books could be read, which subjects could be discussed, and who had the authority to speak. Education, in her mind, was not about learning, it was about obedience. When Harry Potter began teaching Dumbledore's army, it wasn't simply an act of defiance, it was a rebellion against the very ideology Umbridge represented. She had made it clear through every decree that practical magic was not to be taught, not because it was ineffective, but because it empowered the wrong people. Her idea of order relied on fear, not ability. She believed that by restricting magical practice, especially among Muggle-born students, she could restore a society where status, not talent, defined one's place. Progress for the sake of progress must be discouraged, she declared in her infamous opening speech, words that masked a deeper truth. Progress threatened her illusion of control. A chilling example of her ideology surfaced during the trial of Mary Cattermole, a Muggle-born witch married to a ministry employee. Umbridge, now a high-ranking official in the Muggleborn Registration Commission, presided over the trial with a demeanor of smug superiority. She wore a locket she claimed was a family heirloom, Salazar Slytherin's locket, in fact, while asking Mary to prove she had magical lineage. There was no way to pass this test because, in Umbridge's view, magic in the hands of someone born to Muggle parents was an error, a crack in the system. She wasn't just enforcing the law, she was using it to erase lives. Dolores's deep alliance with the ideology of blood purity was not just theoretical. In the very language she used, there was contempt for difference. She called Muggleborns undesirables, and in private documents unearthed later, she described them as statistical anomalies that dilute the power of wizarding kind. She viewed the magical world as something that needed protection, not from dark forces, but from diversity. To her, integration of Muggleborns into magical education was not a triumph, but a threat. Her dream was not a better society, it was a narrower one, where the lines of heritage determined access to power. Inside Hogwarts, the consequences of her views were felt most sharply by students who didn't come from traditional wizarding backgrounds. Dean Thomas, a Gryffindor in Harry's year, was often met with suspicion. Though he was talented and loyal, his Muggle-born status placed a target on his back. Luna Lovegood, though pure blood, was also treated with contempt for being different. But it was in the silencing of students like Neville Longbottom, who came from a respected wizarding family but lacked initial confidence, that Umbridge's poison truly took root. She made students believe that mistakes were signs of weakness, and weakness was unforgivable. Umbridge's office was a reflection of her mind. Behind the pink decor and enchanted kittens was a meticulous archive of student behavior, surveillance records, and informant reports. She wanted to control the very thoughts of students, and nothing made her angrier than independent thinking. When Hermione raised questions during class, she was reprimanded. When Harry claimed Voldemort had returned, she gave him detention with the cruel quill that carved words into his skin. "I must not tell lies," it said, over and over. It wasn't just punishment, it was re-education. She wasn't interested in truth. She was interested in conformity. What set Umbridge apart from even the Death Eaters was her bureaucratic precision. She didn't scream or torture in dungeons. She used official letters, school decrees, and ministry mandates. She created legal pathways for oppression, and in doing so, she made herself more dangerous. The law became her weapon, and within it, she was invincible. Even Dumbledore found it difficult to counter her influence because she operated within the system. She didn't break rules. She rewrote them. The most insidious part of Umbridge's worldview was how calmly she justified her actions. She didn't see herself as evil. She believed she was preserving tradition. Her tone was always polite, her smile always rehearsed. But beneath that exterior was someone who believed that some people simply didn't deserve the life they had. Magic, to her, was not a birthright of all wizards. It was a luxury for the few. She saw people like Hermione not as prodigies, but as intrusions, clever but misplaced, talented but unwelcome. When the centaurs finally carried her off into the Forbidden Forest, it was not simply a punishment, it was poetic justice. She had tried to impose human order onto a world of wild, ancient beings, just as she had tried to impose her version of magical society onto the students of Hogwarts. But the forest did not recognize her laws, the centaurs did not respect her title, and in that moment the spell of her illusion broke. She was no longer the power behind pink curtains. She was just another frightened person who had underestimated the cost of arrogance. After the fall of Voldemort, Umbridge was arrested, but her legacy lingered like a bad spell. Her laws, though repealed, had left marks. Students who had lived under her rule carried the scars, some physical, some emotional, but they also carried a greater understanding of what magic truly meant. It wasn't about blood or background, it was about choice, responsibility, and unity. The very students she tried to silence became the voices of a new era, and in that her failure was complete. It is easy to imagine the battle for Hogwarts being fought with wands and curses, but the quieter battle, the one fought in classrooms, in detentions, in whispered meetings in the Room of Requirement, was just as important. Dolores Umbridge tried to reduce magic to a tool of privilege. She failed not because her methods were crude, but because her belief was false. Magic was never meant to be chained to birthright. It was meant to be discovered, nurtured, and shared. And that truth, defended by students, not soldiers, is what ultimately defeated her. Number 22 encouraged students to spy on each other. It was not just the pink cardigans or the china plates with fluffy kittens that made Dolores Umbridge one of the most loathed figures to ever step foot in Hogwarts. Behind her sugar-coated smile and simpering voice was a system of control so insidious that it twisted the very fabric of trust that held the school together. Her reign as High Inquisitor was marked not only by punishment and censorship, but by a far more damaging weapon, betrayal. One of her cruelest innovations was the institutionalized encouragement of student informants, a tactic pulled straight from the darkest pages of authoritarian regimes. Within a matter of weeks, Hogwarts transformed from a place of magic and camaraderie into a network of spies, where every whisper could be overheard, every friendship used against itself. Dolores Umbridge understood one basic principle of fear. People are easier to control when they fear each other more than they fear you. She made this principle a cornerstone of her rule, launching what could only be described as an intelligence operation inside the castle. The Order of the Phoenix describes this with chilling clarity. They're trying to discredit Dumbledore, make it look like he's losing his grip, and she's using every nasty trick in the book to do it, spying on students, encouraging them to inform on each other. The castle's corridors echoed not just with footsteps, but with paranoia, as students second-guessed every conversation, every confidant. Suspicion became the new school policy. In this newly designed system, betrayal was not just tolerated, it was rewarded. Umbridge created a system of incentives that appealed to the ambitious, the insecure, and the easily manipulated. She offered privileges to those who turned in their peers, better grades, lesser punishments, or in some cases mysterious special favors whose details were never fully revealed. Even the coveted role of inquisitorial squad was dangled before students like Draco Malfoy, who was quick to embrace his new authority. "We're allowed to dock points now," he boasted smugly. But Umbridge's influence extended beyond petty punishments. She sought to crush the very idea of student solidarity. Marietta Edgecombe was one of the most memorable victims and perpetrators of this cruel strategy. A Ravenclaw student and close friend of Cho Chang, Marietta was drawn into Umbridge's network of informants under pressure and persuasion. She betrayed the existence of Dumbledore's army, the secret student group that had dared to resist Umbridge's oppressive regime. Her actions were not merely the product of personal weakness. They were the result of a system specifically designed to make betrayal seem like the safest path. By offering protection and recognition to those who complied, Umbridge reprogrammed students to see loyalty as dangerous and treachery as logical. The cost of that betrayal was immediate and brutal. Dumbledore's army, known only to a select few, had been practicing defensive spells in the Room of Requirement, a hidden chamber only accessible to those who truly needed it. The group had been cautious, keeping their activities secret and their membership limited. But when Marietta disclosed the truth, it was a blow that struck to the heart. "Umbridge knows," Hermione said, her voice heavy with the weight of realization. The betrayal wasn't just logistical, it was emotional. For Harry, Hermione, and Ron, the idea that someone could turn on them so easily was a bitter pill to swallow. The magic of the room couldn't protect them from the corrosion of trust. But Umbridge's influence didn't stop with one betrayal. The ripple effects of her strategy poisoned the air of Hogwarts for the rest of the year. Students began to eye each other warily, unsure of who had spoken to whom. Friends grew cautious, jokes were muted, even classroom discussions became battlegrounds of hidden agendas. Any word said in confidence could be twisted and reported. Teachers, too, felt the chill. Professor Trelawney was one of the first victims of Umbridge's campaign of control, her classroom performance monitored and criticized by the Inquisitor. Eventually, Umbridge declared her unfit to teach, demonstrating that no one, student or staff, was safe from surveillance. The idea of collective punishment also began to surface. Entire houses suffered when one student was suspected of disobedience. Hufflepuffs, Ravenclaws, even some Slytherins found themselves targets of investigations. Prefects were instructed to report anything unusual. The castle became less a school and more a cold institution of informants and fear. No one knew who might be listening through a keyhole or watching from a corner. Even enchanted objects, mirrors, paintings, statues, were suspect. The magical environment that once nurtured learning now enforced silence. One of the most alarming aspects of Umbridge's tactic was how she framed it as a service to the school. She never presented herself as a villain. Instead, she cloaked her actions in the language of safety and order. "Discipline must be maintained," she would say, as if the slow collapse of interpersonal trust was a necessary evil. Her methods mirrored those of authoritarian regimes that rely on internal espionage to keep control. She didn't need to use the Cruciatus Curse to instill terror. She used subtlety, psychological manipulation, and the erosion of community. The effectiveness of this strategy came not just from its cruelty, but from its effectiveness. Even Hermione, one of the brightest minds in the school, underestimated just how deep Umbridge's tactics would cut. Her idea of using an enchanted contract to expose traitors backfired with Marietta Edgecombe. Though Marietta was punished, her face erupting in pustules spelling sneak, the damage had already been done. The betrayal had already served Umbridge's purposes. The contract's revenge was not justice, it was merely a scar on a symptom of a deeper sickness. Perhaps most disturbing was how young minds began to absorb and mimic these methods. Students who once rolled their eyes at rules became enforcers of them. Pansy Parkinson and other Slytherins took to their inquisitorial squad duties with a zeal that went beyond loyalty. They were empowered by the fear they inspired, walking the halls like little tyrants, docking points and spying on gatherings. Umbridge didn't just manipulate students, she infected them. In their eyes, discipline became power. That power tasted sweet, and for some, it was intoxicating. The psychological toll was heavy. Harry's own experience with Umbridge's punishments had already scarred him, physically and emotionally. The lines he carved into his hand during detention, "I must not tell lies," were nothing compared to the scars that formed when he realized people like Marietta could be swayed so easily. The lesson wasn't just that adults could be cruel, it was that peers could be turned into tools of cruelty. That realization stung more than any blood quill ever could. In a perverse way, Umbridge's system succeeded where even Voldemort had failed. She dismantled Hogwarts from the inside out, not with curses or killing, but with whispers and fear. She weaponized insecurity. She made it logical to betray. She turned young witches and wizards into pieces on her chessboard, never realizing they had souls, loyalties, and guilt. When she finally lost her grip on power, dragged screaming into the Forbidden Forest, it wasn't just a victory for Dumbledore's army. It was a breath of clean air in a castle suffocating under suspicion. The memory of those months lingered. Even after Umbridge was gone, students took time to recover. Some friendships never returned to what they had been. Others were quietly rebuilt over time. The ghost of betrayal does not leave easily, and Hogwarts had to rebuild not just its walls, but its heart. Dumbledore himself later acknowledged the insidious nature of Umbridge's rule. It was not the unforgivable curses that destroyed hope, it was the erosion of trust. That, he knew, could kill more slowly and more thoroughly than any spell. Dolores Umbridge never saw herself as evil. She viewed her actions as noble, her punishments as lessons, her manipulation as order. But the truth was clear to every student who lived through that year. She broke the spirit of Hogwarts in ways that even Death Eaters had not. Her forced surveillance, her system of incentivized betrayal, her demand for students to spy on students. These were acts of psychological warfare. And though she smiled through it all, her legacy was one of shadows. A school is not merely a building, it is a community. Umbridge shattered that community and expected a thank you in return. Number 23 lost everything and never repented. Dolores Jane Umbridge once sat high within the gleaming walls of the Ministry of Magic, her soft pink cardigans and sickly sweet smile hiding a heart as cold as the dungeons of Azkaban. She wielded power like a blade, precise, cruel, and merciless. But when Voldemort fell and the wizarding world was forced to face the ruins of what had been allowed to grow in the shadows, Umbridge did not slip away. She stood trial, and for the first time the world stared directly at the grinning face of bureaucratic evil. She was found guilty of numerous offences: the unlawful persecution of Muggleborn witches and wizards, the authorised use of the blood quill on children, wrongful imprisonment, and aiding in the establishment of a regime built on blood purity. And yet, even as the chains of Azkaban closed around her, Dolores Umbridge never bowed her head. In the courtroom, survivors told their stories. Mary Cattermole cried openly as she described how Umbridge accused her of stealing magic and condemned her to Dementor's kiss without evidence. Ernie Macmillan, once a proud Hufflepuff, testified about the scars Umbridge left on students at Hogwarts during her reign as High Inquisitor. "I must not tell lies," he quoted, showing the faint pink lines that still crossed his hand. The court listened, and there was little debate. Dolores was sentenced to Azkaban for life. Yet she left the courtroom with her head held high, muttering about standards and the decline of magical discipline. Azkaban changed most people. Surrounded by Dementors, haunted by regret, they crumbled. But not Dolores. According to a senior warden, she requested pink upholstery for her cell, demanded sugar in her tea, and insisted on being addressed as Madam Undersecretary. Even among the most broken souls of Azkaban, her arrogance stood unmatched. She considered herself wronged, not by the law, but by the world. In her eyes, she had been a loyal servant of justice, keeping order where others were too weak to do so. That twisted vision of righteousness never left her. She wrote letters, hundreds of them, to the Wizengamot, to Kingsley Shacklebolt, the new Minister of Magic, to the Daily Prophet, all signed with a flourishing pink D. Umbridge. She titled one particularly bitter missive on the collapse of magical law and the rise of anarchy. In it, she accused the new ministry of submitting to the demands of mudbloods and half-breeds. The Prophet refused to publish them, but staff reportedly kept them as curiosities, relics of a mind so disconnected from reality it had begun to rot in its own delusion. Her disdain for fellow inmates was legendary. She referred to most of them as common criminals or filthy miscreants, but the Muggleborns she still called abominations. A half-blood healer named Jeremiah Flint recalled how Umbridge threw her food at him, screaming that he had no right to touch her. "It wasn't just cruelty," Flint said, "it was belief." She really thought she was better than everyone else in that place, even the walls. The ministry eventually placed her in solitary confinement, not as punishment, but for her own protection. Her hatred was so pure it provoked even the most tormented prisoners into violence. At Hogwarts, her memory lingered like a curse. Students who had passed through her reign remembered the snide looks, the public humiliations, the silence she enforced with threats. "She was worse than Snape," Neville Longbottom once said, "because at least Snape wasn't pretending. Umbridge always smiled when she hurt you." In Professor McGonagall's office, a framed decree once issued by Umbridge still hangs, a reminder of how power in the wrong hands can poison the very heart of learning. But Dolores never reflected on any of it, not once. She never questioned the blood purity ideology that had fueled her actions. She never showed remorse for the children she tormented, the lives she destroyed, or the lies she wrote into law. Instead, she clung to her own twisted logic. To her, her fall was not justice, but betrayal. She saw herself as the last true guardian of magical order, a martyr of the old ways. The irony, of course, was that she was never a Death Eater. She never bore the Dark Mark, never openly served Voldemort. But she didn't need to. Her evil didn't wear skull masks or shout curses in battle. It signed paperwork. It smiled as it passed unjust decrees. It punished children in the name of discipline. Dolores was the perfect villain for a world where evil didn't always look monstrous. She looked like someone's aunt, someone's teacher, and that made her all the more terrifying. Even Harry Potter, who had faced down the Dark Lord himself, said of her in Order of the Phoenix, "It's people like her that make you think there's something worse than death." He meant it. The rage he felt during her time at Hogwarts was different from what Voldemort stirred. Voldemort was a monster. Umbridge was human, and that was what made her evil feel inescapable. She didn't want to kill him. She wanted to break his spirit, erase his voice, and rewrite his truth. Years after her imprisonment, rumors circulated of her still writing. A sympathetic guard once smuggled out one of her pages. In it, she spoke of building a new order, one without mongrels and half-castes. "Justice must return," she wrote. "The stain upon our world must be scrubbed clean." It was chilling in its conviction, no reflection, no apology. Just the same fervor that had led her to chain innocent people to courtrooms and laugh as dementors circled. Her cell, by all accounts, was orderly. She arranged her meagre belongings with meticulous care. A cup, a quill, a notebook. She painted the word discipline on her wall in looping script, using a strand of her own hair and tea. Her madness wasn't chaos, it was control. And that, perhaps, was the greatest horror of all. In a prison of despair, she built herself a kingdom of order, a tiny pink tyranny in a world that had long since condemned her. There were attempts to rehabilitate her. Mind healers visited, offering therapy and magical treatments to address her delusions. All failed. She rejected every offer with polite contempt. "I am not the one who is sick," she said. "The sickness lies in the new order, in the decay of bloodlines and the collapse of values." She looked them in the eyes and dismissed their diagnosis as leftist nonsense. She never doubted her path. In contrast, others from the regime cracked and confessed. Yaxley wept during trial. Travers begged for mercy. Even Lucius Malfoy, once proud and cruel, distanced himself from the worst of Voldemort's actions. But Dolores, she stood alone. Not because she was brave, but because she had nothing else left. No family, no friends, no followers. Only her beliefs. Beliefs sharper than any wand. And when she died, quietly, in her cell, at the age of 83, few mourned her. Her funeral was unceremonious, no flowers, no visitors. The Ministry released a one-line statement: "Dolores Jane Umbridge, former Ministry employee, has passed away in custody." But in dark corners of Azkaban, a whisper passed from inmate to inmate: "The pink one is gone." And there was silence. A silence. Deeper than mourning, the kind that follows when something truly sinister has finally, completely ended. But even death could not erase her legacy. The educational decrees she wrote were studied in classes on magical ethics. Her name appeared in textbooks under the chapter "The Dangers of Bureaucratic Power." A new generation learned her story not with fear, but with resolve. She became a symbol, not of fear, but of vigilance. A reminder that evil doesn't always roar. Sometimes it wears pearls and drinks tea, sometimes it believes it is doing good. And that is why Dolores Jane Umbridge remains one of the darkest figures the wizarding world ever knew. Not because she lost, but because she never believed she was wrong. Number 24 spied on her own family. Dolores Umbridge had many faces, but none as carefully concealed as the one tied to her own blood. Within the halls of the Ministry, she projected the image of a pure blood loyalist, an unshakable believer in magical superiority. She wore her pink cardigans like armor, smiled with her thin lips pulled tight, and clutched her teacup with a grip that could shatter porcelain. But behind that carefully arranged facade was a deep rot she never allowed anyone to see. For Umbridge, family was not sanctuary. It was a threat, a crack in the wall she spent her life fortifying. Most believed Dolores simply distanced herself from her family due to shame. Her mother, Ellen Cracknell, was a Muggleborn witch who never quite fit into magical society, and her younger brother, Edward, was a squib, a child born into magic without a drop of it in his veins. But what few understand is that Dolores's estrangement was not passive. She did not just turn her back, she pursued them. She monitored, obstructed, and manipulated their lives to erase them from the magical record entirely. She didn't merely hide her past, she hunted it. Through her growing influence in the Ministry of Magic, Dolores secured quiet access to various magical surveillance tools meant only for high-level security matters. Under the pretense of national threat investigations, she abused these connections to keep a meticulous watch on Ellen and Edward. When her brother attempted to take a job at a magical apothecary in Liverpool, a modest position offered by an old friend of the family, it was Dolores who intervened. The friend, Thomas Avery, received an anonymous owl warning him that harbouring a known squib would put his own blood status into question. Within hours, the offer was revoked. The same happened when Ellen Cracknell tried to attend her former schoolmate's funeral in Diagon Alley. Dolores, using her position in the improper use of magic office, had aurors stationed near the Flu network entries, ostensibly to check for illegal charms. Ellen was quietly detained, questioned for over 6 hours, and eventually forced to return home with a stern warning not to involve herself in magical affairs. No charges were filed, no paperwork was left, but the message was clear. In her personal file at the ministry, which Dolores kept meticulously hidden behind enchantments even Mad-Eye Moody would have respected, were names and addresses of anyone who had ever spoken publicly about her background. There were marginal notes next to each one, some marked with red ink, some crossed out entirely. An elderly woman named Mrs. Parson, who once lived 2 doors down from the Umbridge family in Lower Sydenham, was known to have told a neighbour, "I remember Dolores when she was just a frightened little thing, always ashamed of her brother." A week later, Mrs. Parson's granddaughter was fired from her position at the Department of Magical Games and Sports. No reason was given. Dolores's fear was not irrational, at least not to her. She was a woman climbing a brittle ladder of status and power, and at every rung her past threatened to drag her back down. She had clawed her way up in a society obsessed with bloodlines, and the existence of her mother and brother was a living negation of everything she claimed to be. The truth wasn't just inconvenient, it was poisonous. That paranoia consumed her. Every movement of her family was noted, catalogued, and suppressed. Her obsession reached a peak in 1994, the same year she attempted to pass the anti-werewolf legislation targeting Remus Lupin. At the same time, Edward, struggling with finances and isolated from both worlds, began tutoring half-blood children who had trouble with basic charms. His students were the sons and daughters of shopkeepers and widows, people no one in the upper ministry ranks noticed. But Dolores noticed. She sent a quiet decree to the Department of Magical Education, suggesting that squibs offering magical tutoring be classified as unsanctioned magical assistants, and therefore subject to investigation. Within 2 months, Edward was forced to stop teaching. What she feared most, however, was exposure from within the ministry itself. A man named Garrett Mallory, a low-ranking archivist with a fondness for tea and idle gossip, once stumbled across an old file from the magical register that included Dolores's parentage. It was he who first realized that Ellen Cracknell had not, in fact, died, as was commonly assumed, in the ministry. When Garrett mentioned this over drinks at the Leaky Cauldron, he was quietly removed from his position 2 weeks later. His memory was never modified. He remembered everything, but no one would hire him again. He died 3 years later, penniless and embittered. Dolores never confirmed the existence of her brother or mother, not once, not even under veritaserum when questioned during internal ministry security reviews. When asked about her family in interviews or by colleagues, she would stiffen ever so slightly, lift her chin, and reply with cold finality, "My family has no relevance to my service." That line was repeated almost verbatim in a memo she sent in 1995 to a curious journalist named Mildred Travers, who dared to inquire about Umbridge's origins for a profile in Witch Weekly. Mildred's article never ran. Travers's editor received a letter from the Department of Magical Law Enforcement citing defamatory risk, though no such law had been violated. Her hatred of Edward, in particular, was legendary in the shadows of the ministry. A former assistant of hers, Patrick Wilkes, once overheard Dolores muttering in her office, "He should never have been born. His weakness taints everything I've built." Patrick, disturbed by the venom in her voice, left the Department of Magical Law Enforcement within the year. He later testified during Umbridge's trial in 1998 that she spoke of her family like a disease she had survived. Even during her brief tenure at Hogwarts, Umbridge's obsession with bloodlines and personal history was evident. She took particular pleasure in questioning students like Dean Thomas, whose parentage she could not verify, and Seamus Finnegan, whose mother was a witch, but father a Muggle. "It is the duty of the ministry to preserve purity," she once wrote in a report about Hogwarts staff, "and to ensure that all connections to impure or deviant blood are severed or neutralized." The language she used, clinical, cold, strategic, reflected the same framework she used to cut off her family. Years later, during her trial for crimes committed under the Muggleborn Registration Commission, a document was discovered in her private safe, a sealed letter addressed to Ellen Cracknell. It was never sent. The parchment was stained at the edges, as though burned slightly, and the writing was colder than a Dementor's breath. "I was never your daughter," it read. "You were a stain. I cleaned it." That letter, presented as evidence, left many in the courtroom stunned into silence. Though much about Umbridge remains buried beneath the layers of corruption and cruelty she fostered, her relentless suppression of her family offers the clearest window into her twisted values. In a world where even Death Eaters mourned their kin, Dolores chose surveillance, erasure, and intimidation. She viewed connection as contamination and identity as a costume to be stitched together from lies and loyalty to power. The wizarding world has seen dark figures, Voldemort, Bellatrix, Grindelwald, but Umbridge's darkness was of another kind. Hers was quiet, domestic, bureaucratic. She didn't cast unforgivable curses with flair or glee. She signed documents, closed cases, redirected inquiries, rewrote files, and silenced neighbors. She killed nothing with her hands, but she ruined lives with her quill. And through it all, Dolores remained untouched by guilt. Even when Harry Potter exposed her lies, even when the ministry fell, even when the truth about her past crawled out into the daylight, she never faltered. As she once told Marietta Edgecombe with terrifying softness, "Loyalty is everything and disloyalty is remembered." To Dolores Umbridge, family was the greatest disloyalty of all. Number 25. Had a personal vendetta against Hagrid. Dolores Umbridge's hatred toward Rubeus Hagrid was never a passing dislike. It was a deeply personal crusade fueled by prejudice, entitlement, and obsession with control. From the moment she set foot in Hogwarts as the new High Inquisitor in Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix, she marked Hagrid as an anomaly to be corrected or erased. Her loathing had little to do with his teaching qualifications and everything to do with his bloodline. Hagrid was a half-giant, a heritage Umbridge considered filthy and unnatural. That, in her mind, was enough to justify systemic harassment. She did not hide her contempt. She made it her mission to remove him not merely from his post, but from the very institution of wizarding respectability. Her first act of aggression came not with words, but with absence. When Umbridge evaluated the professors at Hogwarts, she conspicuously delayed her visit to Hagrid's class. This was not an oversight. It was a tactic. When she finally arrived weeks later, it was during a lesson that was intentionally made to appear chaotic. Hagrid was teaching about thestrals, mysterious and misunderstood creatures that could only be seen by those who had witnessed death. Though the students were engaged and curious, Umbridge sneered at the lesson, pretending not to understand Hagrid's words, claiming his accent was incomprehensible. She made loud, patronizing remarks, asking him to please enunciate. In truth, Hagrid's speech was perfectly understandable, but she had already decided he was unfit, and her performance was meant to humiliate. Her prejudice ran deeper than simple elitism. She saw Hagrid's entire being as a threat to her ideal of wizarding purity. In her eyes, a half-giant could not possibly hold authority, especially not in a classroom filled with impressionable students. She never questioned professors like Binns, who taught mind-numbing lectures, or even Trelawney, whose legitimacy was questionable at best. But Hagrid's presence offended her principles. She orchestrated surveillance efforts, sending ministry officials to evaluate his lessons under false pretenses. The moment she believed she had enough fabricated evidence, she used her authority to suspend him. Even the manner in which she had Hagrid removed was brutal. Late one evening, she led a squad of Aurors to forcibly evict him from the grounds. The attack was sudden and violent. Hagrid, though gentle by nature, fought back to avoid capture. In the scuffle, Professor McGonagall attempted to intervene and was struck down by multiple stunning spells. Hagrid, carrying the unconscious Fang in his arms, fled into the Forbidden Forest. The scene was one of cruelty, not justice. Umbridge did not care that her actions endangered a beloved teacher and injured another. In her mind, she was purging filth. Umbridge's vendetta did not end with Hagrid's departure. Once he returned to Hogwarts after Dumbledore's reinstatement, she made several attempts, through unofficial channels, to block him from teaching again. Even after her own disgrace and removal from power, she lobbied the department for the regulation and control of magical creatures to deny Hagrid any future employment involving magical beings. Her influence ensured that Hagrid was blacklisted from numerous wizarding institutions. It was no longer about Hogwarts, it was about erasing his professional existence altogether. This vendetta stemmed from more than political power. Dolores Umbridge harbored a personal, deep-rooted disdain for anything she could not control or categorize. Hagrid embodied that chaos. He was a half-giant with a big heart, teaching about dangerous beasts, living on the edge of the forest, forming friendships with creatures like Buckbeak and Grawp. Umbridge could never understand or tolerate the idea that such a being could be respected or loved. His compassion was a threat to her doctrine of fear and obedience. She considered his popularity among students to be a flaw in the system, one she intended to correct. Hagrid's resilience only fueled her hatred. Despite the constant attacks, he never lashed out in cruelty. He returned to his post, kept teaching, and remained loyal to Dumbledore and the school. This quiet strength infuriated Umbridge, who thrived on subjugation. When intimidation failed, she resorted to sabotage. She spread rumors through ministry contacts, leaked accusations to the Daily Prophet, and pushed for legislation to limit the rights of half-breeds. These were not acts of governance. They were acts of vengeance against a man who had done her no harm but refused to bow. The books never state outright why Umbridge hated Hagrid with such venom, but the implications are loud. Her ideology was steeped in blood purity and social hierarchy. In Order of the Phoenix, her infamous decree stated, "The Ministry of Magic has always considered the education of young witches and wizards to be of vital importance." But what she meant was conformity. Anyone who did not fit her mold, be it Harry, Trelawney, or Hagrid, was treated as a pollutant to be eliminated. Hagrid, being both half-giant and emotionally intuitive, was her perfect scapegoat. Her cruelty toward Hagrid mirrored her broader campaign against diversity in the wizarding world. While others feared Voldemort's open violence, Umbridge weaponized bureaucracy. She passed laws targeting non-human creatures, justified discriminatory practices through paperwork, and cloaked her bigotry in official stamps. Hagrid became a symbol of what she feared most, the ungovernable heart. His love for magical beasts, his loyalty to Dumbledore, and his connection to the wild world outside Hogwarts represented a form of life she could never dominate. When questioned about Hagrid, she responded with feigned concern, claiming that his methods were unsound and that she was only protecting the students. But her actions revealed otherwise. In one of the ministry reports later uncovered by Kingsley Shacklebolt, Umbridge had personally recommended further restrictions on the employment of part humans, citing Hagrid's violent tendencies as justification. No such tendencies existed. Hagrid had never harmed a student. His only crime was being different in a system rigged against him. Perhaps the most chilling example of her bias occurred during her secret meetings with the Centaur Liaison Office. She suggested in writing that centaurs be relocated farther from Hogwarts due to their volatile nature. The irony, of course, was that she herself had provoked them during her infamous venture into the Forbidden Forest. Hagrid, on the other hand, had always treated the centaurs with respect. Umbridge's fear of the unknown was so intense that even proximity to the wild, symbolized by Hagrid's hut, triggered legislative action. Hagrid never responded to her hatred with the same venom. After the Battle of Hogwarts, when Umbridge was arrested for her role in the persecution of Muggleborns, Hagrid expressed no joy. He simply returned to his garden, nursed injured creatures, and resumed his life. That was his final act of resistance, not revenge, but peace. He won not by destroying Umbridge, but by surviving her. He remained a part of Hogwarts long after she was a disgraced footnote in wizarding history. In retrospect, Umbridge's obsession with Hagrid reveals more about her than it does about him. She could not stand that someone like him, uncultured, unpolished, unorthodox, could be beloved. She feared that students would admire his courage and kindness more than her strict decorum and laws. In her need for order, she tried to eliminate what she could not predict. But Hagrid was not an anomaly. He was the heart of Hogwarts, and that to Umbridge was intolerable. Her failure was complete. Hagrid remained at Hogwarts through the rise and fall of Voldemort, through ministerial shake-ups, through wars and trials. When he carried Harry's body from the Forbidden Forest in Deathly Hallows, it was a moment of raw humanity and loss. That image of a half-giant weeping for a boy he loved stood in stark contrast to everything Umbridge represented. She had tried to silence him, erase him, diminish him, but in the end it was his voice that carried, his presence that endured. She was forgotten. He became legend. Number 26. Had no real friends, even among dark supporters. Dolores Umbridge was never truly one of them. Among the cold corridors of the Ministry and the shadowy circles of Voldemort's loyalists, she hovered like a ghost, present, powerful, but never welcome. She adorned herself in pink and surrounded her office with kitten plates, yet her essence was made of thorns. Even when the tide of power favored the Dark Lord, even when she operated under the twisted banner of purity and control, Umbridge stood alone. Unlike Bellatrix Lestrange, who was loved by madness and shared blood with the dark elite, or even Lucius Malfoy, who used his wealth and charm to build fragile alliances, Dolores had no anchor. No one truly chose her. She was tolerated, used, and discarded when her usefulness ended. Her isolation was not accidental. It stemmed from the very nature of her soul, a deep craving for control disguised under layers of false courtesy. At Hogwarts, during her reign as High Inquisitor, her power came from fear, not loyalty. Even in the Ministry, where order and procedure were the ruling gods, she was treated more like a venomous artifact than a respected colleague. Cornelius Fudge leaned on her as a tool, not as a friend. He never invited her for tea outside their plotting. Her influence was strategic. The warmth of camaraderie never touched her. While Umbridge shared some ideological ground with the Death Eaters, particularly the obsession with blood status and authoritarian rule, she was never welcomed into their fold. They recognized in her something they despised, not courage, not madness, but a coward's cruelty. When the ministry fell and Voldemort's influence infected the institution, Umbridge slid comfortably into a new role as head of the Muggleborn Registration Commission. Her smile grew wider, her punishments harsher, but even then the Death Eaters kept her at a distance. She was never marked. That simple absence said everything. Even those who killed in Voldemort's name thought her unworthy of their brand. Bellatrix Lestrange, rabid and loyal, would never have sat beside Umbridge by choice. The Death Eaters' silence around Dolores was telling. She was not invited to their gatherings. She was not whispered about as a sister-in-arms. Instead, she was seen as a bureaucratic enforcer, the ministry's weaponized paranoia. The likes of Yaxley and Rookwood might have shared corridors with her, but not trust. They recognized her for what she was, a woman who thrived when power was absolute and consequence was none, but who would not bleed for any cause. They were loyal to Voldemort. Umbridge was loyal only to structure and herself. Her betrayal of others was legendary. The students at Hogwarts felt it first. "I must not tell lies," she made Harry carve into his own hand. That line, which should have lived only as an ugly memory of school cruelty, followed her into the ministry. She continued to twist the truth until it served her. When Mary Cattermole stood trembling in front of her during a hearing in Deathly Hallows, Umbridge was not merely following orders. She delighted in it. Her locket, a stolen piece of history from a murdered family, hung at her neck like a badge of false purity. The scene painted her perfectly, a woman drunk on invented righteousness, punishing the innocent to maintain her fragile illusion of order. Yet even in this terrible role, no one defended her when the tables turned. When Harry, Ron, and Hermione stunned her during their infiltration of the ministry, no Death Eater came running to her aid, no colleague protested. Her downfall was quiet, ignored, expected. She was not missed. Her office was left cold, and her name was not spoken with vengeance or regret. Voldemort never bothered to ask about her fate. She had always been a means to an end, never a sister in darkness. Her usefulness had expired. The irony of her downfall was brutal. She, who had spent her life clawing toward power through sycophancy and cruelty, was ultimately undone by her inability to form bonds. Every act of cruelty she committed was a brick in the wall that separated her from humanity. Even her co-workers like Mafalda Hopkirk and Perkins never showed any affection for her. They were polite at best. Some avoided her. Others obeyed her only because they feared losing their jobs. Power without respect is thin ice, and Umbridge danced on it until she cracked it herself. When Kingsley Shacklebolt rose to power after the war, he personally ensured that Umbridge would answer for her crimes. She could not plead innocence because no one came to her defense. Testimonies stacked against her. Her name became a quiet cautionary tale in the rebuilt ministry, what happens when cruelty is masked as duty. Even her fellow bureaucrats, once silent under her regime, now gave accounts of her vindictiveness. She had cultivated no goodwill, no quiet friend stepped forward. Her coldness had left her abandoned. In Order of the Phoenix, Dumbledore warns, "You are blinded by the love of the office you hold." Umbridge was more than blinded, she was consumed. She loved the role more than the people it governed. She believed in obedience, not understanding. She saw rebellion as chaos, not as a response to injustice. This fundamental disconnect kept her from ever truly belonging, even in systems that thrived on control. She could mimic ideology, enforce it, even thrive under it, but she could never inspire it. Her presence chilled rooms. Her praise felt like poison. Her version of loyalty was submission without question, and that terrified even the monsters. Even among the teachers at Hogwarts, her presence left nothing but scars. Professor McGonagall despised her, Snape tolerated her, Flitwick quietly defied her. No one befriended her. She sat alone during meals. She patrolled alone. She was, in every sense, a woman who brought silence with her. Not the comfortable silence of shared understanding, but the suffocating kind that makes people check their tone and watch their words. That silence was her company. The Centaur's capture of her in the Forbidden Forest wasn't just a plot event, it was a symbolic collapse. Nature itself rejected her. Creatures that hated human cruelty and hypocrisy saw her as the embodiment of both. She screamed for mercy, but mercy had never been her language. She had not sown compassion, so none was returned. Even when Dumbledore rescued her, she did not thank him. Gratitude was foreign to her. She viewed every event through the lens of power, who had it, who lost it, and how she could benefit. When questioned later about her time at Hogwarts, she minimized everything. She called the students disobedient, the teachers ungrateful, and the events exaggerated. She never acknowledged the pain she caused. In her mind, discipline was virtue, even if it left bleeding hands and broken spirits. That worldview kept her safe from guilt, but locked her away from connection. Even her family, what little was known of them, never entered the public eye. No siblings visited her, no friends wrote letters, no old mentors defended her legacy. Her isolation became complete when the war ended. In Azkaban she was neither feared nor revered, she was simply forgotten, not as a villain worth hating, but as a bureaucrat whose cruelty was too dull to inspire legend. She never had a cause, she had policies. No one tattooed her name in memory, not even to curse it. The most chilling thing about Dolores Umbridge was not what she did, but how forgettable she was once her power was gone. Evil with a purpose can be remembered, evil without a face becomes dust. There were many villains in the wizarding world, each with their own loyalists, their own tragic backstories or philosophies. Umbridge had none. No one mourned her fall. No one read her memoirs. No one asked, "What happened to Dolores?" Because everyone knew she became exactly what she had always been, alone, unloved, and irrelevant once the system changed. Her fear of chaos had come true, not through rebellion, but through abandonment. The world moved on and she was left behind. A cautionary tale in pink. Number 27 tried to rewrite school history. Dolores Umbridge did not see history as a record of truth, but as a weapon to bend minds and ensure obedience. When she was appointed High Inquisitor of Hogwarts during Harry Potter's 5th year, her reforms extended far beyond educational policies and disciplinary measures. With a twisted smile and pink cardigan, she infiltrated every corner of the school, including the very foundation upon which it was built, its history. Her efforts to revise the past were as deliberate as they were dangerous. She believed that memory could be controlled, and by reshaping how students remembered the events of recent years, she could reshape their beliefs, loyalties, and fears. She began her assault on the truth in the classroom. While other professors taught the defense against the dark arts by combining practical skills with real-world understanding, Umbridge's approach was sterile, manipulative, and tightly controlled. Her textbook of choice was Defensive Magical Theory by Wilbert Slinkard, a book infamous for its dull prose and theoretical absurdities. The text deliberately avoided any mention of real threats, especially Voldemort. To Umbridge, omitting the name of the Dark Lord wasn't just a ministry order, it was a strategy. By erasing the language of resistance, she erased the concept itself. But Umbridge's ambitions reached even deeper into the school's soul. She ordered revisions to the school archives, targeting reports, journals, and student accounts of Voldemort's return, Cedric Diggory's death, and Harry's involvement in the Triwizard Tournament. Records that once told of Harry's bravery and Cedric's tragic end were now rewritten or quietly locked away. According to these new records, Cedric had died in a tragic accident, and Harry's version of events was labelled inconsistent and emotionally unstable. The manipulation was surgical. She did not destroy everything. She changed enough to cast doubt, enough to poison trust. In the History of Magic curriculum, she demanded edits to the syllabus taught by Professor Binns. Although the ghost professor rarely updated his lectures, Umbridge saw even his dry and monotonous retellings as a threat if they failed to align with the Ministry's official narrative. She pushed for the glorification of the Ministry's role in wizarding history, especially during the First Wizarding War. She insisted that Cornelius Fudge's leadership be praised as a model of wisdom and restraint, despite the chaos that had unfolded under his rule. Her edits turned a messy human story into a tale of infallible government, and her own name began to appear suspiciously often in the margins of these revisions. The school portraits did not escape her ideological cleansing. Traditionally enchanted to reflect the personalities and knowledge of their subjects, the portraits had long served as advisors, storytellers, and even silent witnesses. But during Umbridge's rule, many of these paintings were removed from the corridors. Some portraits, like that of former headmistress Dilys Derwent, known for her vocal disapproval of tyranny, vanished overnight. It was whispered among students that even Phineas Nigellus Black, despite his Slytherin loyalty, had been charmed to remain silent. Umbridge viewed dissent as disease, and in her warped world, even paintings had to be loyal or be discarded. In the library, the censorship was equally intense. Books like Rise and Fall of the Dark Arts and Modern Magical History were suddenly deemed inflammatory and restricted from student access. Madame Pince, though fiercely protective of the collection, was forced to follow orders. Some books were removed entirely, while others were discreetly rewritten with new prefaces praising ministry oversight and dismissing alternative narratives as youthful exaggeration. Hermione Granger noticed the subtle shift in tone. A previously balanced account of the First Wizarding War now presented the Order of the Phoenix as well-intentioned but reckless, while the Ministry was described as the only legitimate authority in times of unrest. Even the tapestries weren't safe. One particularly ancient tapestry chronicled the legend of the founders and their diverging ideologies. It had long served as a symbol of Hogwarts' complex legacy, a legacy that balanced light and shadow. Under Umbridge, this artwork was replaced with a new, pink-framed embroidery depicting ministry officials handing wands to happy children in a sunlit classroom. The founders were gone, replaced by a vision of obedience and state-sanctioned joy. She didn't just want to teach obedience, she wanted it woven into the very fabric of the school. What made Umbridge's rewriting of history even more insidious was how it targeted the most recent and most painful truths. The death of Cedric Diggory, once mourned openly, became an uncomfortable subject. Students were discouraged from mentioning him by name. The Goblet of Fire's final event was officially classified as a mismanaged inter-school activity in new school documents. No mention of Barty Crouch Jr. impersonating Mad-Eye Moody, no mention of the graveyard, no mention of Voldemort. The silence became deafening, and students began to question what they had seen, what they had lived. Her strategy was not just about control. It was about creating a vacuum where no resistance could grow. Without stories of courage, there could be no inspiration. Without memories of sacrifice, there could be no cause. "You have been told that a certain dark wizard is at large once again," she said coldly during one of her classroom lectures. "This is a lie." It wasn't just denial, it was a carefully constructed narrative reinforced by doctored textbooks, censored records, and a climate of fear. She rewrote the past so that the present would have no context and the future no hope. In the staff room, even seasoned professors felt the chill of her historical manipulation. Professor McGonagall, known for her unwavering integrity, confronted Umbridge more than once. But even she found herself powerless as policies were handed down from the ministry. "Progress for progress's sake must be discouraged," Umbridge said, but what she meant was that truth for truth's sake must be buried. She believed that knowledge was a tool best kept in the hands of the powerful, not the curious. One of the most chilling examples of her revisionism came during an inspection of Professor Trelawney's classroom, Though divination had always been viewed with skepticism, Umbridge dismissed it entirely as superstition and hysteria. She declared that the original prophecy made by Trelawney, the one concerning Voldemort and Harry, was unverified hearsay, and ordered all related records sealed. In the official school registry, the entry for the prophecy was replaced with the vague term, personal incident, no educational relevance. A moment that had shaped the fate of the wizarding world was buried under bureaucratic ink. When the students formed Dumbledore's army in secret, it was not just a reaction to the absence of proper defense instruction, it was a rebellion against the erasure of truth. They trained not only in spells but in memory. They passed on stories, named names, and honored the dead. In many ways, the DA became a living archive, resisting the rewriting of the past by preserving it through word and action. Umbridge feared this above all else. She understood that history wasn't just something written in books. It was something lived in bodies, shared in whispers, and carried like a torch in darkness. Even the centaurs in the Forbidden Forest knew her tyranny extended into time itself. Their wisdom, rooted in the stars and the unchanging cycles of the world, clashed with her belief that history could be molded like clay. When they eventually dragged her away into the woods, it wasn't just revenge, it was a cosmic correction. She had tried to warp something eternal, and the forest responded in kind. Perhaps most symbolically, after her fall from power, the removed portraits were restored, the censored books returned, and the dusty archives reopened. But something had changed. The students had learned that memory could be fragile, that history could be stolen. Harry himself often reflected on how close they had come to forgetting what was real. In Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix, Dumbledore later told him, "The truth is a beautiful and terrible thing, and should therefore be treated with great caution." For Umbridge, truth was neither beautiful nor terrible. It was simply inconvenient. By trying to rewrite the past, Dolores Umbridge nearly succeeded in controlling the present. But the resistance she provoked ensured that the real story of Hogwarts would live on, not in dusty pages but in the minds of those who chose to remember,